Hey everyone, welcome back to Strange Mind 6. I'm your host Ruby, and today we're going to be getting back into Beware the Claws That Catch Alice by Christina Henry. But before we begin, please grab a snack, grab a drink, or sit back and relax, and let's get to it. Alice nodded. She did see. The smoke must have gone up in her brain because everything seemed soft at the edges. "There's a ledge out here," Hatcher said. He went to the wall next to the window, grabbed his right wrist with his left hand, pushed his hanging right arm against the wall, and did some kind of maneuver while Alice watched. When he turned back to her, his right arm appeared normal again. He flexed his fingers as if to ensure they were still functional. Throughout all of this, he never made a sound, not even a hint that the process was painful, though Alice was certain it must have been. He held his hand out so she could join him by the window. She approached him and gasped in shock when his hand closed around hers. It seemed like an electric current ran through their joined hands up to her heart, which hammered in her chest. His gray eyes sparked, and he squeezed her hand tighter for a moment. When you are in an asylum, no one ever touches you in kindness, and Alice knew the shock was as great for him. He said nothing as he released her. He climbed through the window and onto the edge of the ledge, and Alice followed him, because that was what she was supposed to do. She swung her left leg, over the sill. Her shift rode up, exposing her skin to the morning chill as she shivered. She supposed it wasn't so terribly cold out. But after the furnace of the burning hospital, the outdoors seemed frigid. Alice ducked her head under the sash and saw the ledge Hatcher wanted her to reach. Below it, too far below for comfort, was the river, gray and putrid. Now that she saw it, she remembered what she had forgotten before. Hatcher moved on the ledge behind her, and his hands were at her waist, guiding her out until they stood side by side, their backs pasted against the brick exterior of the hospital. The ledge was barely wide enough to admit the length of Alice's feet. Hatcher's toes curled around the edge as if that grip could save him from falling. His expression was fierce and exultant. "We're outside, Alice. We're out." "Yes," she said, and her thrill at this prospect was much tempered by the sight of the river. Now that she was away from the smoke, her mind was clearer, and this plan seemed riskier than trying to climb down a set of burning stairs. The stench of the water reached her then, and she gagged. Hatcher grabbed her hand to keep her from stumbling forward into the empty air. "We jump into the river," he said, "and swim across the opposite bank. We can disappear into the old city after that. No one will look for us in there. They will think we're dead." "Yes," she agreed again, "but we're not supposed to go into the river. It will kill us. All the factories dump their waste there. I remember Father speaking of it. He said it was an outrage." "Neither can we stay here," Hatcher said. "If the fire does not consume us, then they will catch us in their nets and put us back in our cages. I cannot go back, Alice. I cannot spend the remainder of my life as a moth beating its wings against the jar. I would rather perish in the mouth of the Jabberwock than that." Alice saw the truth of this and felt it in her heart as well. She did not want to go back inside the box they had made for her, but the river was so far below, churning with poison. What if their skin was seared from their bodies? What if they swallowed the river water and died on the shore as the foul substance coursed in their body? As these thoughts occurred, a burst of flame caused a nearby window to explode outward, startling a huddle of soot-coated pigeons that had taken foolish refuge on the same ledge Alice and Hatcher perched on. The birds took flight, squawking in protest, and Alice looked at Hatcher, knowing he saw the fear in her eyes. "Now, we must fly," he said. "Trust me." She did. She always had, though she didn't know why. He squeezed her hand, and the next thing Alice knew, she was falling away into a rabbit's hole. "Don't let go," Hatcher shouted, just before they hit the water. His grip on her fingers tightened painfully, and she cried out, but he didn't let go, which was a very good thing, because as soon as the horrible muck coated her head, she reflexively loosed her hold, and if Hatcher hadn't been holding her that way, she would have drowned. He yanked her, coughing and gagging, to the surface, scooped an arm under her ribs, and began paddling toward the shore. "Kick your feet." She fluttered her ankles weakly in the water. It felt thick and strange, with none of the fluid slipperiness water was supposed to possess. It moved sluggishly, the current hardly enough to push them a few inches, of course. A noxious vapor rose from the surface, making her eyes and nose burn. Because of the way Hatcher held her, she couldn't see his face or the opposite shore that they approached. His breath was smooth, and even like he was unaffected by the miasma floating above the surface of the river. He pulled them both along with smooth, sure strokes, as Alice floundered in the water, trying not to cause them both to go under. She saw the asylum burning behind them as tongues of flame emerged, from newly opened windows. The distance and roar of the fire drowned out the sound of the inmates screaming. There were people running around the sides of the building, trying to stop the spread to the adjacent structures. She had never given much thought to the places around the hospital before. On one side was a long, low building, crouched against the bank of the river like a squat turtle. That must have been on the side that Alice's room had been. Else she wouldn't have been able to see the moon. The edifice on the opposite side was huge, much bigger than the hospital, and the smoke belching from its chimneys seemed as thick and dangerous as that pouring from her former home. "Put your feet down," Hatcher said suddenly, and Alice realized he was walking now, not swimming. Her toes sank into the muck, and the water was still up to her neck, but they were nearly there. A small knot of people was gathered a little ways down the bank on a jetty, pointing and exclaiming over the collapsing asylum. "I see them," Hatcher said in a low voice. "Over here." He guided her toward a place where the shadows lay thick despite the rising sun, away from the flickering exposure of the gas lamps set at intervals to elevate the fog from the river and factories. Alice fell to her hands and knees, just out of the water, taking great gasps of air. Even a few feet away from the river, the air was noticeably cleaner, though hardly what one would call clean, she thought. Everywhere was the stench of the water, the reek of smoke and flame, the chemical burn of factory exhaust. Underneath it all was the smell of the morning's cooking coming from the warren of flats just before them. Hatcher had done much more than Alice to get them out of the burning hospital and through the disgusting river, yet he had not collapsed like she had when they emerged from the water. He stood beside her, still and calm. Alice rolled to her feet. Alice rolled to her seat and looked up at him. He stared, transfixed, at the fairy structure across the water. He stood so still that she began to worry, and she struggled to her feet. "Hatcher?" she said, and touched his arm. His hair and clothes were steaming now that they were on shore, and he was coated in the filth they had just crossed. His gray eyes glowed in the reflection of the fire like the coals of hell, and when he turned those eyes on her, she felt for the first time a little afraid of him. This was not Hatch, her constant companion through the mouse hole, nor was this the man who had methodically rescued her from a burning building. This was Hatcher, the murderer with the axe, the man who had been found covered in blood and surrounded by bodies. "But he would never hurt you," Alice told herself. "He's still Hatch somewhere in there. He's just lost himself for a moment. She put her hands on his shoulders tentatively and said his name again, for he stared at her but did not seem to see. Then his hands were at her wrist, his grip bruising the thin skin, and his iron eyes were wild. "He's out! He's out! He's out!" he chanted. "Now the world will break and burn and bleed. And everyone will bleed." "The Jabberwock?" Alice said. "His mouth will open wide, and we will all fall in, and be devoured," Hatcher said. "We must get away before he finds me. He knows I can hear him. He knows that I know what evil he will do." Suddenly there was a tremendous noise from the asylum, a sound like the very heart of the building crashing in on itself. Alice and Hatcher turned to watch, and all the walls collapsed like a melting sandcastle. There seemed to be nothing but fire now, and the fire shot impossibly upward into the sky, well past the point where there was anything to burn. It filled the horizon, the wings of a monster outstretched. Behind the flame was darkness, a gigantic shadow that spread, as if something that was trapped was now free, reaching its arms toward the sun. "Is that him?" Alice asked. She never believed in the Jabberwock, not really, and perhaps there was no shadow at all. She was exhausted and had spent some time breathing smoke and poison. Her brain might tell her there was a shadow when in fact there was none. That was the trouble with not being right in the head. You couldn't always tell if your eyes were telling the truth. Hatcher did not reply to her question. He stared for a moment at the tower of flame, and then grabbed Alice's right wrist, tugging her up the bank. The mud inhibited fast progress, but they finally managed to clamber onto the narrow cobbled path that ran around and between the warrens of tilting structures stacked crazily against one another. The old city seemed to have no beginning and no end, a circling maze of stairways and narrow alleys connecting buildings that had been patched and rebuilt on top of crumbling ruins for centuries. There was nothing gleaming and new there, not even the children who seemed to be birthed with haunted eyes. Hatcher ducked into the nearest alley, pulling Alice after him. The rough stones scraped her bare feet, but she understood that she needed to disappear quickly. Aside from the question of the Jabberwock, Alice had recognized the distinctive brass button gleam of a copper's uniform. Never mind if the asylum was not but a cinder now. If they were caught out in their hospital whites, the police would drag them away, and Alice had a feeling Hatcher would not go quietly. So they dipped and darted between the girls with their customers pressed up against the alley walls, or old men gathered in clusters around a shell game or a cockfight. Hatcher led them deeper into the old city, to a place where the rising sun was blocked by the closeness of the buildings, and the air was blanketed in fog from the factories. Mist rose from the cobblestone, hiding approaching figures until they were nearly upon you, which was how the men surrounded them. Hatcher paused for a moment, seeing Alice out of breath and suffering. He did not pat or comfort her, but waited. In that moment that they were still, an enormous ogre loomed out of the darkness and swung a club at Hatcher. Alice opened her mouth to scream, but a filthy hand covered it, and another hand latched on her breast, squeezing it so hard tears sprang to her eyes. "What have we here?" a rough voice cooed in her ear. "A little lost lamb." She kicked out, tried to slip out of his clutch as Hatcher and that ogre, whom she now saw was a man, the largest man she had ever seen, disappeared into the fog. Her struggles were useless against her captor's strength as he dragged her away. His free hand moved from her breast to the hem of her shift, pulling it to her waist, his fingers on her thighs, and she went wild then, biting down on the hand that covered her mouth, because she remembered a man over her in the flickering light, pushing between her legs, and it hurt. She screamed because it hurt, and he kept at it until she bled. The man who held her now swore as he felt her teeth, but he did not let go. "Little hellion," he snarled and slammed her forehead against the brick wall. She went limp and dazed then for a moment, and something wet and sticky covered her eyes. Then she was on the ground, on her belly, her bare thighs scraping against the stone, and his hands were on her bottom, pulling her legs apart. "Just go away," she thought. "You're not here. You're in a green field in a valley, and the sun is shining. And here comes someone smiling at you, someone who loves you." Then the hands on her were gone, and she heard the sound of flesh meeting flesh. She rolled to one side, her shift still up around her waist, and wiped the stickiness from her eyes. Hatcher was pounding her attacker repeatedly with his fists. He had pushed the man's back against the wall and was methodically reducing the man's face to an unrecognizable blob of jelly. After several moments, Hatcher released the man, who fell limp to the ground. He did not appear to be breathing. Hatcher turned to Alice, his chest heaving. He was covered in blood, his hands and chest and his face. His eyes went from the cut on her head to the bare waist and lingered there for a moment. Then he said, "Cover yourself," and turned away to search the man's pockets. Alice pulled the shift down to her knees again and used the wall to help her stand. She leaned there for a moment, and her body began to shake all over. When Hatcher turned back, her teeth were chattering. He held a small pouch in one hand. "Full of gold," he said, nudging the limp body with his toe. "Probably a slave trader. He would have used you and then sold you." "I think I was sold before," she said. She had a memory of money changing hands, of seeing a smaller hand being filled with gold from a larger one by the man with the long ears, or to him. Hatcher asked. She shook her head. There had only been that flash of terror, of a memory best forgotten. There had been a man, but she couldn't remember his face. Then her mind reasserted her and itself, keeping her safe. He paused in front of her, a savage splatter with the blood of her attacker. And there was something around his face that was oddly vulnerable. "May I?" he asked. He mimed putting his arm around her shoulder. Everything inside her was clenched and cried no. Then the moment passed, and she remembered how he had stared at her bare legs and turned away instead of falling on her like a ravening wolf. She nodded and saw relief on his face. His arm went around and pulled her tight to his body for a moment, so she could feel the coiled strength in him. Then he loosened enough so she could walk, but did not let go. They returned to the place where the ogre had attacked. Alice saw the body of the larger man there. He still breathed, slowly and shallowly. Through the broken mess where his teeth used to be, nearby on the ground, was the club he had used on Hatcher. It was actually just a thick rod of wood, with a slightly oversized end. It was broken in two pieces. "We must get inside somewhere," Hatcher said. "Where can we go that's safe?" Alice asked. "Does this place seem familiar to you?" "It does," he admitted, "though I don't know why. From the moment we stepped inside the old city, my feet have been leading us someplace." "Someplace safe?" she asked. The cold was in her bones now, making her tremble all over despite the warmth of Hatcher holding her close. She was hungry and tired and more scared than she could ever remember being. For a brief moment, she longed for the certainty of the hospital, the security of four walls around her. "I don't know," he said. "It's been many years since I've been here. Some places look the same, more the same than you'd think, and others seem much different, though I can't put my finger on why." "I don't think your memory is as gone as you think," Alice said. "You remember things like the time of magicians, and that men like that sell girls like me. And you know the city. You've only forgotten who you are." "No," Hatcher said. "I know who I am now. I've forgotten who I was before. Probably for the best. You might not like who I was then. I might not either." Alice remembered who she was before. She just could not recall what had happened to that girl to make her this girl, and given the flashes she'd just seen, that was probably for the best. Hatcher was right. Maybe not remembering was better. She shook under his arm. He rubbed his shoulder with his hand, fruitlessly trying to impart heat. "I can't get warm," she said. "We're nearly there." "Nearly where?" "I don't know. It's where my feet are leading us. It's someplace safe." Alice noticed they'd emerge from the maze of alleys into a thoroughfare. It wasn't packed, but there were plenty of people going about their morning's business. Women with their heads wrapped in scarves against the chill, carrying baskets of eggs and cabbages and fish wrapped in paper. Men leading donkeys laden with coal or firewood, or making quiet trades on the slide. Boys in ragged caps and bare feet pinching apples from carts when the proprietor was not looking. Everyone who saw Alice and Hatcher averted their eyes and veered away, but the two of them did not seem to cause sufficient alarm that the police were called, for which Alice had been grateful. None of these folks would want the authorities sniffing around, for she was certain that more than fruit and coal were being sold off those carts. Every person made it clear that no help was to be found there, but no hindrance either. "When we arrive," Hatcher said, "there will be an old woman, and she will know me, and she'll let us in." Alice wondered who this old woman was, and why Hatcher was so sure she would help. She wanted to ask, but Hatcher probably would not know the answer anyway, and her stomach was starting to churn, even though there was nothing in it. If they'd still been in their rooms, the morning porridge would have come hours ago. Alice coughed and tasted something foul in the back of her throat. "I feel sick," she moaned. "Nearly there," Hatcher said, steering her around the corner of a storefront selling healing potions and down another alley. "I won't make it," Alice said, and broke away from Hatcher to heave against the wall. Her stomach retched upward, her throat burning, but all that came out were a few thin drools of bile. Alice leaned her aching forehead against the cool brick and winced when the rough surface scraped against the scabbed knot given her by the man who would have raped her. The nausea had not passed. Instead, the outburst had only made her feel worse. "Just a little farther," Hatcher said, tugging at her hand, her shoulder. "It's the powder making you sick." "I haven't had my powder today," Alice said. "Precisely," Hatcher said. "How many years have you had a powder with breakfast and supper?" "Ever since I went to the hospital," she said. It was a terrible struggle to put one foot in front of the other. She could barely lift her leg from the ground. Her toes curled under and scraped along the stone, the skin there peeling away and leaving it raw. Hatcher badgered and dragged her the last few feet. When finally they reached the plain wooden door, tucked in a notch halfway down the alley, Alice was on the verge of collapse. Hatcher pounded on the door with his fist, his other arm keeping Alice from folding up in a heap on the ground. The door opened, and a very small woman, knotted and ancient, appeared in the opening. She wore a blue dress covered by a faded red shawl. Her hair was white, and her eyes were as gray as Hatcher's. She took one long look at him, and Alice thought she heard a little sigh. Then the woman said, "Nicholas, I've been waiting for you for 3 days." The end of chapter 2. Tune in next time to hear chapter 3. And as always, my dear friends, have a wonderful morning, noon, or night. This has been Ruby, signing off.